What becomes of a soul when it is left to the mercy of the unforgiving wild? When a woman, stripped of everything but the child in her arms, finds herself on the doorstep of a stranger, is it a cruel twist of fate, or the first step toward a destiny she could never have imagined? This is the story of such a moment when a shivering woman clutched her hungry baby at a lone cowboy's cabin, and how he turned their shared despair into a legacy of love. Jedediah Stone's world was carved from silence and solitude. The wind that swept across his High Plains ranch was his most constant companion, its mournful cry a mirror to the hollow ache in his own chest. His cabin, built with his own 2 hands, was more fortress than home, a bulwark against a past that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. The ghosts of a wife and daughter, taken by a fever that had swept through their camp years ago, lived in the grain of the wood and the flicker of the hearth fire. He had built this life not to live, but to endure. Each sunrise was a duty, each sunset a reprieve. He worked his land with a relentless energy, his muscles coiled and hard, his face a testament to the sun and the sorrow that had creased it. He asked for nothing and expected less. His heart carefully shuddered against the possibility of further pain. But the frontier, in its infinite cruelty and occasional grace, had other plans. A storm was gathering in the west, a bruised and purple mass of clouds that promised a lashing rain. Jed was securing the last of his livestock in the small barn when he first saw it, a flicker of movement near his porch, a shape that did not belong. His hand went instinctively to the Colt peacemaker at his hip, his eyes narrowing. Coyotes grew bold in weather like this, but this was no animal. It was too still, too huddled, a portrait of pure desperation. He moved with a quiet, deliberate tread, the dust barely stirring beneath his worn boots. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into the form of a woman. She was collapsed against a porch post, her dress a collection of rags that offered no protection from the biting wind. In her arms, wrapped in a thin, soiled blanket, was a baby. The woman's head was bowed, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable shivers. She didn't seem to have the strength to knock, or perhaps she had lost the will to even try. Jed's caution evaporated, replaced by a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a deep, gut-wrenching compassion. He saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own deepest fears, of loss, of helplessness, of being utterly alone against the vast, indifferent expanse of the world. He knelt beside her, his voice rough but gentle. She flinched, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale and gaunt, her lips tinged with blue. She clutched the baby tighter, a primal, protective instinct that seemed to be the only fire she had left. He saw the raw fear in her gaze and held up his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue after so long. "There's a storm coming. A bad one. You and the little one can't stay out here." He didn't wait for an answer. He saw the decision was beyond her. With a gentleness that belied his rugged frame, he scooped her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, as if she were made of little more than bone and desperation. She let out a small, broken sob but didn't fight him. As he carried her across the threshold of his cabin, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, striking the tin roof like a drumbeat heralding a profound change. He kicked the door shut against the rising gale, plunging the room into a dim, firelit sanctuary. He had just let the world in, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. Inside the cabin, the sudden warmth was a shock to the woman's system. She trembled violently in his arms as he gently set her down in a large wooden chair he'd made for himself by the stone hearth. The fire was low, just a bed of glowing embers, but Jed quickly added logs, coaxing the flames back to life. They leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls and throwing a warm, golden light on her pale face. He moved with an economy of motion, his actions sure and steady. He pulled a thick wool blanket from his own bed and wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it in as if she were a child. She sank into its warmth, her shivering beginning to subside, though her eyes never left him, tracking his every move with a mixture of terror and exhausted wonder. The baby in her arms let out a thin, reedy cry, a sound of profound hunger. Jed's focus shifted immediately. "The little one," he said softly. "Is it a boy or a girl?" Her voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "A boy." Leo. Jed nodded, his expression softening. He moved to the small kitchen area, his movements surprisingly deft. He found a can of milk, pried it open, and diluted it with a little water, warming the mixture carefully over the fire in a small, clean pan. He poured it into a bottle he hadn't used in years, a relic from another life that he could never bring himself to throw away. He tested the temperature on his wrist, the gesture automatic, a muscle memory that brought a fresh wave of old pain. He pushed it down, focusing on the here and now. He handed the bottle to her, and her trembling hands could barely hold it. He knelt before her, his large, calloused hands gently guiding hers until the baby latched on, suckling with a desperate, frantic energy. A single tear traced a path through the grime on the woman's cheek. "Thank you," she breathed, the words barely audible. "My name is Jedediah," he said, his voice low. "You're safe here." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw past the stern, weather-beaten exterior to the deep well of kindness in his eyes. "I'm Alara," she whispered. She said nothing more, and he did not press. He could see the story in the hollows of her cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes, the tattered state of her clothes. It was a story of hardship and betrayal, a common enough tale on the frontier, but seeing it embodied in this fragile woman and her starving child made it feel like the cruelest tragedy in the world. He made a thin broth for her, and she drank it slowly, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the last of the chill. Exhaustion finally claimed her. Her eyes fluttered closed, her head slumping against the back of the chair, her hands still resting protectively on her sleeping son. Jed watched her for a long moment, the silence of the cabin broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. He had spent years building walls around his heart, but this woman, this stranger, had walked right through them without even trying. He gently lifted the sleeping baby from her arms and placed him in a makeshift cradle he fashioned from a sturdy wooden crate, lining it with his softest spare shirt. Then, he carefully lifted Alara and carried her to his own bed, pulling the covers over her. He spent the night in the chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, watching over them, a self-appointed guardian against the storm both outside and within. The next morning, his old ranch hand, Gus, arrived, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and skepticism. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene, the sleeping woman in Jed's bed, the baby in the crate, and Jed himself looking more tired and more alive than Gus had seen him in years. "Jedediah," Gus said, his voice a low grumble. "What in tarnation have you done now? You know better than to pick up strays." "Strays bring trouble." Jed turned from the fire, his gaze unwavering. "She needed help, Gus." "That's the end of it." Gus shook his head, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the door. "That's never the end of it, boy. Trouble follows a woman like that like a shadow. You mark my words." Alara, awake now, overheard the exchange from the bed. Fear clutched at her heart. She was a burden. She was trouble. But then she saw the look on Jed's face as he stared down his old friend, a look of quiet, unshakable resolve. In that moment, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. In the days that followed, a fragile routine began to weave itself into the fabric of their lives. The cabin, once a bastion of Jedediah's solitary grief, slowly started to breathe again. Alara, regaining her strength, refused to be idle. She insisted on earning her keep, her pride a quiet but fierce force. She mended the tears in Jed's work shirts with neat, careful stitches, her needle-pricked fingers a testament to her determination. She took over the cooking, transforming his meager supplies of flour, beans, and salted pork into simple but nourishing meals. The scent of baking bread soon filled the small space, a warm, comforting aroma that battled against the ghosts of the past. The silence between them gradually softened, replaced by the small sounds of a shared existence, the gurgle of baby Leo, the gentle scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft murmur of their voices in the evenings. Jed would return from a long day of wrangling cattle or mending fences, his body weary but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He would sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack, and listen as Alara's story emerged in hesitant pieces. She told him of her husband, Thomas, a man full of grand dreams and empty promises. He had taken a job as a foreman on a vast, prosperous ranch owned by a man named Silas Blackwood, promising to send for Alara and their newborn son as soon as he was settled. The letters had been hopeful at first, full of talk of the fine house they would have and the bright future ahead. Then, the letters had stopped. Consumed by worry, Alara had sold what little they had and joined a wagon train heading west, her heart a leaden weight of dread. When she finally reached the town nearest the Blackwood Ranch, she was met with cold stares and colder words. A grim-faced man told her that Thomas was dead, killed in a so-called riding accident a month prior. When she asked to see Mr. Blackwood, she was told the rancher had no time for a penniless widow. Her husband's final wages, they claimed, had been used to cover his debts. Stranded and heartbroken, she was left behind by the wagon train, the townsfolk turning their backs on her plight. She had survived for weeks on the charity of a poor preacher's wife before setting out on foot, a desperate, hopeless pilgrimage to find any shelter, any kindness, before the coming winter claimed them all. Jed listened to her tale, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of his chair. He knew of Silas Blackwood. The man owned half the valley and ruled the other half through fear and intimidation. He was a snake, coiled and waiting, with a reputation for cruelty that was whispered about in hushed tones. The story of Thomas's accident felt thin, a convenient lie to cover something far uglier. As Alara spoke, Jed found himself sharing parts of his own story, unlocking chambers of his heart that had been sealed for years. He told her about Sarah, his wife, whose laughter had been as bright and warm as a summer sunrise. He spoke of Lily, his daughter, a small girl with her mother's eyes and a spirit as wild as the mustangs they used to watch from the porch. He described the fever, the helplessness of watching them fade, the crushing weight of a silence that had descended upon his life and never truly left. In sharing their grief, they forged a powerful bond. They were two broken souls, survivors of different storms, who had washed up on the same shore. One evening, as Leo slept soundly in his crate, Jed found Alara staring into the fire, her expression distant and sorrowful. "He used to sing to me," she said softly, not looking at him. "Thomas. He had a terrible voice, but he sang with such feeling. I find myself trying to remember the songs, for Leo's sake, but the melodies are fading." Jed's heart ached for her. Without a word, he retrieved an old, dusty harmonica from a wooden chest. He hadn't played it since Sarah's passing. He brought it to his lips, and a slow, sweet, melancholy tune filled the cabin. It was a simple frontier ballad, a song of loss and hope, of long trails and the dream of a home. Alara looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't speak, but a profound understanding passed between them. In that shared music, they found a language beyond words, a comfort for wounds that had never properly healed. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a sanctuary, a place where two lonely people and a helpless child were starting to feel like they might, one day, become a family. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered by the thunder of approaching hooves. Jed was splitting logs in the yard, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady beat against the morning quiet. He paused, leaning on the handle, his senses on high alert. 3 riders were cresting the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the bright blue sky. They rode with an arrogance that spoke of power and ill intent. Jed's hand strayed to his hip as he recognized the man in the lead. It was Silas Blackwood. He was a man who looked out of place on the rugged frontier, dressed in a fine black coat and a pristine hat, but the cold, predatory gleam in his eyes was as wild and dangerous as any wolf's. He reined in his horse a few feet from Jed, his gaze sweeping over the modest cabin and the small corral with open contempt. His 2 companions, brutish men with cruel faces, remained mounted behind him, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. "Stone," Blackwood said, his voice a silky sneer. "I heard you'd taken in some charity." "I came to see for myself." At that moment, Alara appeared in the cabin doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. The color drained from her face when she saw Blackwood. She instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her throat as if to ward off his venomous presence. Blackwood's thin lips curled into a triumphant smile. His eyes locked onto her, stripping away her dignity with their invasive stare. "Ah, there she is." The grieving widow he dismounted with a fluid, reptilian grace. "I'm here to collect what's owed to me." Jed stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Blackwood and the cabin door, a solid, immovable wall of defiance. "She owes you nothing," Jed said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous rumble beneath the surface. "Her husband, Thomas Vance, was in my employ," Blackwood continued, ignoring Jed and speaking as if Alara were a stray animal to be claimed. "He was a fool and a gambler. He ran up a considerable debt before his unfortunate accident, a debt of loyalty and labor, which, by the terms of his contract, now falls to his next of kin." His gaze flickered to Leo, who had started to cry from inside the cabin. "That includes the woman." And the boy. The air grew thick with menace. The implication was monstrous, a form of indentured servitude that was little more than slavery. Alara let out a choked gasp, her worst fears realized. This man wasn't just cruel, he was evil. "She is under my protection," Jed stated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word laced with cold iron. "She is not property, and you will not lay a hand on her or her son." "Now get off my land," Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Protection." You're a fool, Stone. A lonely man playing hero. You think you can stand against me? I own the law in this valley. I own the judge. I could have you strung up for horse theft by noon tomorrow if I felt like it. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. This isn't over. I am a patient man. I will have what is mine. That woman will work off her husband's debt, one way or another. He held Jed's gaze for a long, tense moment, a silent battle of wills fought in the dusty yard. Then, with another sneering smile, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his men following like vultures in his wake. They left a poisonous silence behind them. The threat lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Alara sagged against the doorframe, her legs trembling. The sanctuary had been violated. The monster she had fled had found her, and now he was standing at the gate, threatening to devour not just her, but the one man who had shown her kindness. Jed didn't look at her. He continued to stare at the spot where Blackwood had been, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He had invited trouble to his door, just as Gus had warned. But as he heard Alara's soft, terrified weeping, he felt no regret. Only a cold, hardening resolve. This was his land. This was his home. And he would sooner die than let that snake cross his threshold again. The immediate aftermath of Blackwood's visit was a pall of fear and despair that settled over the small cabin. Alara was inconsolable. She paced the floor, her movements agitated, her mind replaying the rancher's cruel words and possessive gaze. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom within her had been crushed, replaced by a suffocating guilt. He's going to destroy you, she whispered, her voice choked with tears as Jed entered the cabin that evening. This is all my fault. I've brought this darkness to your door. I should leave. I'll take Leo and go, disappear into the hills. It's the only way to keep you safe. She was already gathering her few meager belongings, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fold the small blanket Leo had been wrapped in. Jed crossed the room in 2 long strides and gently took her hands in his, stilling their frantic movements. His grip was firm, grounding her, a silent anchor in the storm of her fear. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze intense and unwavering. Listen to me, Alara, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. You are not leaving. This is my home. And as long as you are in it, you are safe. Do you understand? I will not let that man or any of his dogs harm you or your son. It was more than a reassurance. It was a solemn vow, a promise sealed with the full weight of his honor. He saw the terror still swirling in her eyes and knew that his words, his promise, were not enough. Blackwood dealt in violence and fear. To fight him, they needed more than just resolve. They needed strength. The next morning, he led her out to the corral, the air crisp and cool. From a locked chest in the barn, he retrieved an old but well-maintained Colt pistol, its metal cool and heavy. He held it out to her. She shrank back, her eyes wide. I can't, she stammered. I've never even held a gun before. You can, and you will, he said, his tone gentle but firm. I don't want you to ever go looking for a fight. But if a fight comes to you, if it comes to our door when I'm not here, you need to know how to end it. He spent the next hour patiently teaching her. He showed her how to stand, how to brace her arm, how to line up the sights. His presence was a circle of calm around her. He stood behind her, his chest brushing her back, his arms enveloping hers as he helped her aim at an old tin can set on a fence post. His touch was practical, instructional, yet it sent a jolt of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the weapon in her hand. She could feel the solid strength of him, smell the scent of pine and leather that clung to him. She leaned back into his steadiness, drawing strength from it. Her first few shots were wild, kicking up dust far from the target. She flinched at the loud report, her confidence wavering. Breathe, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. Don't fight it. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. Just breathe. She took a deep breath, focused on the can, and squeezed. The gun bucked in her hand, but this time, the can jumped off the post with a satisfying ping. A small, surprised smile touched her lips. It was a tiny victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time since Thomas's death that she had felt a spark of power, a sense of agency over her own fate. They spent a part of every day after that practicing. Her aim improved, her hands grew steady. The fear that had once defined her began to slowly recede, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve that mirrored Jed's. She was no longer just the desperate woman he had found shivering on his porch. She was becoming a partner in their shared struggle for survival, a fighter ready to defend her child and the man who had given her a reason to fight. Jed watched her transformation with a growing sense of pride and a deepening affection that he could no longer deny. He had offered her shelter to soothe an old wound in his own soul, but in empowering her, he was finding a new purpose. He was no longer just protecting a stranger. He was fighting for a future he was beginning to believe he could have. Silas Blackwood was not a man accustomed to being defied. Jedediah Stone's quiet refusal to bend to his will was like a stone in his shoe, a constant, irritating reminder that his power was not absolute. Unable to intimidate Jed with threats, Blackwood resorted to the cowardly tactics of a predator testing its prey's defenses. He began a campaign of attrition, designed to bleed Jed dry, to break his spirit piece by piece. The first attack came in the dead of night. Jed and Gus awoke at dawn to a scene of calculated destruction. The fences of the north pasture had been cut in a dozen places, the wires snipped with shears. Their small herd of cattle, Jed's entire livelihood, had been scattered across the valley, driven into the rocky, brush-choked canyons. It was a full day of grueling, back-breaking work for the two men to round them up. They rode for hours under the punishing sun, their horses lathered in sweat, their bodies aching. By the time they had driven the last of the herd back into the repaired pasture, they were exhausted and 3 head short, including a newborn calf likely lost to coyotes or a fall. Gus was livid. His usual grumbling turned into a string of potent curses aimed at Blackwood. "See, Jed. This is how he plays," Gus spat, wiping sweat and grime from his face. "He won't face you, Mantaman. He'll nip at your heels like a cur, wear you down until you've got nothing left. This is what comes of taking in that woman. He's punishing you for it. He's trying to break our will," Jed replied, his voice tight with controlled anger as he cinched the last fence wire. "He thinks if he makes life hard enough, I'll give in. We just have to be harder," but the attacks continued. A week later, someone spooked their horses during the night, sending them stampeding through the corral fence. It took 2 days to track them all down. Then, their small vegetable garden, which Alara had been tending with loving care, was trampled, the precious food source for the coming winter destroyed. Each incident was another blow, another drain on their limited resources and energy. The weight of it all began to show on Jed. New lines of exhaustion were etched around his eyes, and his usual quietness was now tinged with a constant, simmering tension. Alara saw the toll it was taking, and her guilt intensified. One evening, she found him in the barn, grimly inspecting a saddle whose cinch had been deliberately frayed, a mishap that could have easily killed him. She watched him work, his powerful hands deftly repairing the leather, and her heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She brought a wet cloth and began to gently clean a long, bleeding scrape on his forearm that he'd gotten while chasing a steer through a thicket of thorns. Her touch was feather-light, a silent apology. "This is my fault, Jedediah," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his arm. "All of this hardship, it's because of me." He stopped his work and looked at her, his expression softening as he saw the genuine pain in her face. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "No," he said, his voice uncharacteristically rough with emotion. "This is not your fault. This is Blackwood's evil. It's a sickness in him. You and Leo. You're not a burden. You're the reason I'm fighting." For the first time in a long time, "I have something worth defending." His words hung in the air between them, a profound confession that went far beyond mere protection. He was no longer just her savior, she was becoming his. In that dusty, dimly lit barn, surrounded by the evidence of their enemy's hatred, they found a moment of pure, unadulterated connection. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, and for a moment, the fear and the fight melted away, leaving only the two of them. After weeks of relentless pressure and harassment from Blackwood, a strange and welcome quiet descended upon the ranch. It was an uneasy peace, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, but they chose to embrace it. For a few precious days, there were no cut fences, no spooked livestock, no signs of Blackwood's malevolence. The reprieve allowed a space for something other than fear to grow between Jed and Alara. One evening, the work was done, and baby Leo was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The sun was setting, bleeding spectacular colors across the vast sky, painting the rugged mountains in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. Jed and Alara sat on the porch steps, side by side, not speaking, simply sharing the profound beauty of the moment. The silence between them was no longer hesitant or awkward. It was a comfortable, living thing, filled with all the words they had yet to say. In this quiet moment, Jed felt a boldness he hadn't felt in years. He turned to her, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "I don't suppose you know how to dance, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She looked at him, surprised, a genuine, lovely laugh escaping her. "Not without music." "And I haven't had much cause for dancing lately. We don't need music," he said, standing and holding out his hand. "We can make our own." She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. His calloused palm enveloped hers, warm and strong. He led her to the middle of the dusty yard, the last rays of sunlight casting them in a warm, golden glow. He placed one hand on the small of her back and drew her close. She rested her other hand on his broad shoulder, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow of his neck. And they danced. They swayed slowly, a silent, graceful rhythm that came from their hearts. There was no music but the chirping of the crickets and the soft sigh of the evening breeze. He could smell the clean, simple scent of soap in her hair, and he felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that he thought he had lost forever. She closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. In his arms, she felt safe, cherished, and for the first time in so long, completely at peace. As they danced, he spoke, his voice soft. "I had a dream for this place, once," he confessed. Before everything. I was going to build another room onto the cabin, expand the herd. I wanted it to be a place that would last, a legacy for my family. A place full of life and laughter." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought that dream died a long time ago." Alara pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the twilight. "It's a good dream, Jedediah Stone," she whispered. "And you have a good heart. The best I've ever known." He looked down at her, at the trust and affection shining in her gaze, and he could no longer fight the tide of emotion that was pulling him under. He lowered his head and gently, tenderly, pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, profound connection. It was hesitant at first, then deepened as all the fear, the hope, the shared grief, and the unspoken longing of the past weeks poured into it. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances and new beginnings. It was a silent promise, made under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the western sky, that they were no longer two separate souls fighting for survival, but one heart preparing for the battle to come. When they finally broke apart, they simply held each other, their foreheads resting together, breathing in the new reality they had just created. The peace would not last, they knew that. Blackwood was still out there, a shadow waiting to fall. But now, they would face him together. The tender peace they had found was as fragile as a desert flower, and it was shattered with brutal finality. Blackwood, perhaps hearing whispers from town about the growing bond between the rancher and the widow, or simply growing impatient with his games of attrition, decided the time for subtlety was over. His rage, fueled by Jed's defiance and his obsessive desire to possess Alara, boiled over into a direct and violent assault. They were jolted from sleep not by a sound, but by a smell, the acrid, unmistakable scent of smoke, sharp and terrifying in the clean night air. Jed was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing his rifle. Through the cabin window, he saw a horrifying sight. The small barn, which housed their 2 horses and their precious winter feed, was engulfed in an angry orange inferno. "Alara, stay inside with Leo and bar the door," he yelled, his voice tight with urgency. He and Gus, who slept in a small bunkhouse nearby, burst out into the yard. The heat from the fire was intense, a physical blow. Their first instinct was to save the animals. As they fought with the jammed barn door, a muzzle flash split the darkness from the rocks above the corral. A bullet splintered the wood just inches from Jed's head. It was an ambush. "Get down!" Jed roared, shoving Gus toward the meager cover of a water trough. 2 more shots rang out, kicking up dirt around their feet. They were pinned down, silhouetted by the very fire that had been set to destroy them. While Jed laid down covering fire with his rifle, Gus managed to wrench the corral gate open, and the terrified horses bolted into the safety of the open pasture. But their victory was short-lived. As Gus turned back, another shot echoed from the darkness, and he cried out, clutching his arm as he stumbled to the ground. Alara, watching in horror from the cabin window, saw Gus fall. The woman Jed had taught to shoot, the woman who had sworn to be a partner in this fight, did not hesitate. Ignoring Jed's order, she unbarred the door, grabbing the loaded pistol he had left on the mantel. Jed saw the movement from the corner of his eye. "Alara, no. Get back inside," he yelled, his heart seizing with terror. but she was already on the porch, taking cover behind a thick post, her face a mask of fierce determination. She raised the pistol with both hands, just as he had taught her, and fired toward the muzzle flash on the ridge. Her shot was answered by a curse of pain from the darkness, followed by the sound of a man scrambling away. The distraction gave Jed the opening he needed. He fired 2 quick shots, forcing the second ambusher to retreat. A tense silence fell, broken only by the roar and crackle of the burning barn. Jed rushed to Gus's side. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his upper arm. It was painful and bleeding profusely, but it wasn't life-threatening. He helped the older man limp back to the relative safety of the cabin. Alara was there waiting, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She immediately began tearing strips from a clean sheet to make a bandage. As they worked to stop the bleeding, the barn collapsed in on itself with a deafening groan, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Their last defense against the winter, their means of travel, their small store of wealth, all gone, turned to ash and smoke. The message could not have been clearer. Silas Blackwood was done playing games. He had tried to starve them out, and he had failed. He had tried to intimidate them, and he had failed. Now, he had drawn their blood. They all knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be back. And the next time, he would come not to harass or to threaten, but to finish it. He was coming for all of them. The dawn that followed the fire revealed a scene of grim devastation. The barn was a blackened, smoking skeleton against the pale morning sky. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and defeat. But inside the cabin, there was no despair. There was only a cold, hard resolve. They knew Blackwood would return, likely with more men, to finish what he'd started. The final confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. They spent the day preparing for a siege. There was no talk of running, no thought of surrender. This small patch of land, this humble wooden cabin, had become the entire world to them, a world they would defend to their last breath. Jed, his face set like granite, worked with a focused, desperate energy. He and Alara dragged heavy furniture against the windows, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. He checked and rechecked every weapon they owned, his rifle, his Colt, Alara's pistol, and an old shotgun Gus kept in the bunkhouse. He laid out boxes of ammunition on the main table, each cartridge a small, brass promise of defiance. Gus, his arm tightly bandaged and held in a sling, refused to be useless. He sat in a chair, his face pale but his eyes sharp, and directed them, his years of frontier experience proving invaluable. Board that south window tighter, Jed. That's where the sun will be in your eyes come dusk. Alara, keep the water buckets full. A fire arrow through the roof is his kind of trick. Alara moved with a quiet efficiency that amazed Jed. The terrified, helpless woman he had found on his porch was gone. In her place was a warrior. Her hands did not tremble as she loaded the shotgun. Her eyes were clear and steady as she helped Jed reinforce the door. She was no longer fighting just for her own survival, or even for Leo's. She was fighting for their family, for the future she had seen in Jed's eyes when he'd kissed her. In the late afternoon, she paused and placed a hand on Jed's arm. "Jedediah," she said, her voice low and steady. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know. You gave me back my life. You gave my son a chance. I love you." He turned and pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. "I love you, Alara," he choked out, the words he thought he would never say again feeling like the most natural thing in the world. "We are going to get through this." Together, as dusk began to settle, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley, they came. A cloud of dust on the horizon resolved into 7 riders, led by Silas Blackwood. They fanned out, surrounding the cabin, their rifles glinting in the fading light. "Stone!" Blackwood's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with venomous confidence. "Your time is up. Send out the woman and the boy now, and I might be inclined to let you and that old cripple live. You'll get nothing from this house but lead, Blackwood." Jed shouted back, his voice echoing with defiance. The answer was a volley of gunfire that erupted from all sides. The cabin walls shuddered as bullets slammed into the wood, splintering it, showering the interior with debris. Leo, sheltered in the safest corner of the room, began to wail. The siege had begun. Jed took his position at the main window, his rifle barking, each shot carefully aimed. Gus, propped up in a chair, fired the shotgun one-handed through a slit in another wall, its blast a deafening roar. Alara was at the small window facing the ridge, the pistol held firmly in her hands. She saw one of Blackwood's men trying to sneak around the side of the cabin. She took a deep breath, remembered Jed's words, and squeezed the trigger. The man cried out and dropped his rifle, clutching a wounded shoulder as he scrambled for cover. A fierce surge of pride shot through Jed. She was magnificent. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The air grew thick with gunpowder smoke. But Blackwood's men were hired guns, not soldiers fighting for a cause. After 2 of them fell to Jed's relentless accuracy, their will began to crumble. Blackwood, enraged, knew he had to end it himself. With a furious roar, he charged the front door, kicking it with all his might. The reinforced bar splintered and broke. The door flew open, and Blackwood stood there, his face a mask of hate, his pistol aimed directly at Alara. Jed reacted instantly, launching himself across the room and tackling Blackwood before he could fire. The 2 men crashed to the floor in a desperate, brutal struggle. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a primal battle. Fists flew, grunts of pain filled the room. This was not about land or debt. It was a fight for the future, for love against possession, for light against the encroaching darkness. Fueled by the image of Alara and Leo, by the burning need to protect the family he had just found, Jed found a reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. With a final, desperate surge, he overpowered Blackwood, slamming his head against the stone hearth. The fight was over. The sudden, deafening silence that followed the struggle was more jarring than the gunfire had been. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths, the whimpering of the baby, and the low moans of the wounded man outside. Blackwood lay unconscious on the floor, his reign of terror finally at an end. His remaining men, seeing their leader fall, had mounted their horses and fled into the gathering darkness like the cowards they were. Jed pushed himself to his feet, his body bruised and aching, and pulled Alara into his arms. She clung to him, trembling, burying her face in his chest. Gus let out a long, shaky breath from his chair, a grim smile on his face. "Well, son," he wheezed. "You sure know how to throw a party." They were alive. They were bruised, battered, and their home was riddled with bullet holes, but they were whole. They were a family, forged and tempered in the crucible of violence. A short time later, another group of riders appeared, but these were not enemies. The sheriff, a man long cowed by Blackwood's influence, had finally been spurred to action by a frantic townsman who had witnessed the beginning of the assault. He arrived with a posse, expecting to find a massacre. Instead, he found Jedediah Stone standing guard over his home, a defiant victor. They took the disgraced and now conscious Blackwood and his wounded men into custody. With Gus's damning testimony and the overwhelming evidence of the siege, Blackwood's iron grip on the valley was broken forever. The townsfolk, who had once shunned Alara and viewed Jed as a fool, now saw him as a hero, a man who had stood up to a tyrant for the sake of honor and love. In the quiet days that followed, they began to rebuild. They patched the bullet holes in the cabin walls, each repair a testament to their survival. Neighbors, now emboldened and full of admiration, came to help Jed raise a new barn, a symbol of the community's support and a promise of a brighter future. One evening, as they stood watching the sunset from the porch, the same spot where they had shared their first dance, Jed turned to Alara. His face was still bruised, but his eyes were filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. "Alara Vance," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "The day I found you here, I thought I was offering you a home. But I was the one who was lost, living in a house full of ghosts. You and Leo. You chased the ghosts away. You are my home." He slowly dropped to one knee on the wooden porch, taking her hand in his. "I know this isn't the fancy proposal you deserve, and this ranch has more scars than strengths right now. But I promise you, I will spend the rest of my days making it a place worthy of you. Marry me, Alara. Let's build that future we talked about." Together, tears of pure joy streamed down her face as she looked at this strong, kind, honorable man. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, yes, Jedediah. 1,000 times, yes." Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the yard under the wide-open sky, attended by Gus and their new friends from the town. The cabin, once a lonely outpost, was now filled with warmth and laughter. It was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was the heart of a family, a testament to their resilience. As Jed watched Alara playing with a giggling Leo near the newly built barn, a deep sense of peace settled over him. His past was not forgotten, but it no longer defined him. The despair he had found in a shivering woman and her hungry child had been transformed, through courage and compassion, into a destiny more beautiful than any he had ever dared to dream. And so we must ask ourselves, when faced with the suffering of another, do we turn away, fearing the trouble they might bring? Or do we open our door, risking everything for a chance to turn despair into destiny? The choices we make, in the quietest moments of kindness, often echo the loudest through the rest of our lives. If you believe in the power of love to conquer even the darkest corners of the Wild West, share this story, and tell us in the comments what you think truly makes a hero.